At the outskirts of the town, Roland received accurate information that the majority of the enemy did not possess the god punishment stone. He stood atop a hill, observing hundreds of people digging several large pits on the ground. Curious, Lightning asked what these pits were for. Roland replied that they were constructing bunkers. Brick walls would be built around these holes, leaving a gap for the musketeers to fire from within. Behind them, a defensive line would be formed, consisting of cannons. The artillery units had increased from 4 to 20 groups, with each group equipped with a 12-pound field cannon. The latest field cannons had an effective range of over a kilometer. Roland quickly formulated a preliminary battle plan in his mind. With a smile, he said to the witches, "If you want to eat something, go to the cafeteria and tell the chef." Maisie and Lightning happily dashed toward the cafeteria. Nightingale held Anna's hand and informed her that when the enemy attacked, she hoped Anna would take over the duty of guarding His Highness and protecting him. Nightingale had to carry out a special mission. Anna glanced at Nightingale for a moment and nodded. Shortly after, the two of them then made their way towards the cafeteria. 3 days quickly passed, and the defense line was nearly complete. The enemy force of 1,000 men advanced toward the border town. 2 leading knights looked disdainfully at the militia behind them. These militia members had not received specialized training and relied solely on pills provided by the church to be of any use. One of the knights sighed, wondering why they had trained in martial arts from a young age when now, even unarmed farmers could join the battlefield by taking a pill. The knight's words furrowed Raymond's brow, but it wasn't the time to dwell on such matters. In the forest through which the enemy passed, Nightingale's figure emerged. The scout in the vanguard reported that they had discovered the town's military forces up ahead. Raymond took a look through his telescope. According to the information gathered from the wolf and elk families, they primarily relied on a long-range weapon to counter the knight's charges. This weapon could launch an attack before the knights reached their top speed, accompanied by flashes and deafening sounds. It resembled a large crossbow but shot projectiles much faster than arrows. The other knight quickly grasped the key point that although these weapons had tremendous power, they couldn't fire continuously. Raymond nodded. He knew that these 1,500 peasants who had taken the pills could run as fast as horses, and by relying on a swarm tactic, they could swiftly break through the defense line and capture the border town in one fell swoop. Just as Raymond was preparing to give the order to adjust the formation, the corner of his eye caught a glimpse of a white figure. He froze, tilting his head as if he heard, "Are you sure?" He looked at the knight beside him, then glanced around, feeling that he might be hallucinating. He raised his long sword, preparing to order the troops to form a sudden formation, but then, among the militia, Echo appeared, mimicking Raymond's voice, shouting, "Swallow the pills and charge." In an instant, 1,500 people swallowed the pills without hesitation. Raymond angrily stared at the other knight, thinking he was behind this trickery. Suddenly, Nightingale emerged from behind him, holding a silver revolver in her hand. She said, "It's high noon." Raymond felt as if his head had been struck by an iron hammer, and the world spun as darkness engulfed him. The other knight stared blankly at Raymond, who had fallen from his horse. The back of his head had completely exploded, revealing a mixture of red and white gush. Then he heard his own voice ringing out. It shouted, "Charge, everyone!" No, he hadn't spoken at all. He covered his mouth and looked behind him. The militia members were eagerly swallowing the pills and charging forward, callously trampling over Raymond's lifeless body as if a human wall was surging toward him. It was the witch, he realized. The witch had imitated his voice. He commanded everyone to stop, but his voice was like a tiny splash in the surging crowd. The rampaged militia had lost all rationality, and some of them were even charging toward him. The situation had completely spiraled out of control. No matter how loudly he shouted, his voice was drowned out by the fervent roars of the crowd. He swung his weapon at the nearest militia member. He surveyed his surroundings, determined to find the witch responsible for this chaos. The battle had commenced, and 20 cannons erupted in unison. Even when struck by bullets, the medicated militia soldiers, their limbs shattered by exploding shells, continued their charge. They swiftly advanced towards the forefront bunkers, with Brian peering through a firing window, observing the encroaching enemy. Gunfire resonated from the leading bunkers as the enemy drew nearer. Prior to the battle, the First Army had been informed that the adversaries were deranged individuals who had ingested church-induced pills. Therefore, the sight of the enemy relentlessly charging through the hail of bullets did not daunt the soldiers. Instead, it ignited their fighting spirit, as the First Army had grown accustomed to confronting such monstrous creatures. The enemy soon closed in within 150 meters. Brian took a deep breath and exclaimed, "Open fire!" The soldiers had eagerly awaited this command, and they wasted no time in pulling their triggers at the carefully aimed targets. In an instant, the bunker was filled with the symphony of gunfire. The first adversaries to cross the firing line were struck by the crisscrossing bullets from both sides, their blood spilling from their waists as they staggered a couple of steps before collapsing to the ground. Brian noticed several individuals attempting to scale the top of the frontline bunker, intending to launch a surprise attack on the soldiers inside. However, they were thwarted by the enclosed bunker that blocked their entry. Without hesitation, Brian redirected his aim and systematically dispatched each exposed assailant. Suddenly, he shouted, "Take cover," as the enemies behind them hurled dozens of spears. However, the bunker intercepted every projectile. One of the fresh recruits chuckled, assuming there was no danger, and stood up. Yet, a spear, perfectly aimed, pierced through the firing window and impaled his chest. Emitting a muffled groan, he collapsed to the ground. Brian quickly began examining his injuries. The wounded soldier's consciousness remained relatively clear as he trembled, anxiously asking if he was going to die. The short spear had slanted into his lower chest, slightly missing his lungs, as his breathing appeared relatively unobstructed. Brian recalled Roland's advice not to remove the spear in such situations, but rather wait for Manhua to treat it after the battle. Placing his hand on the soldier's forehead, Brian asked if he knew about Manhua's abilities. The soldier managed a weak smile and expressed his gratitude for finally having the chance to meet Miss Manhua. Brian firmly clasped his hand, urging him to hold on. After finishing his words, Brian returned to the firing window, while Roland stood on the elevated platform, providing a clear view of the enemy surging towards the town like a tidal wave. With each row of bunkers they crossed, their speed noticeably decreased. By the time they reached the third row of bunkers, the flanks of the enemy were fully exposed to the crossfire of the musketeers. Soon, the enemy breached the 300 meters range, entering the deadly zone covered by the artillery positions, a zone where shotgun pellets reigned supreme. Vaynor commanded the cannons to fire, adjusting their angles to flatten the trajectory. Flames and thick smoke erupted from the cannons, and the devastating impact of the shotgun pellets on unarmored targets was evident, with each ion pellet capable of piercing through 2 to 3 individuals. While the pills provided some resistance to pain, they couldn't suppress the innate fear. Witnessing their comrades being turned into sieves, even the overwhelming excitement and thirst for bloodlust couldn't suppress the instinctual fear of their own lives. As half of their forces lay strewn across the assault path, the enemy began to show signs of retreat. Fear spread like a plague, infecting the militia, who dropped their weapons and fled toward the rear. The leading cavalryman ordered them to come back, but soon enough, a high-velocity artillery shell landed on his head. Roland, observing from the walls, saw the deserters and knew they were never truly a resolute unit. Without the pills, they were just a group of untrained civilians lacking practical combat experience. He hammered the wall in frustration, gritting his teeth. Damning Timothy for utilizing the civilian. The wounded on the defensive line immediately received medical treatment. Manhua had been stationed at the rear of the defense line, ready to provide aid, especially when the enemy turned to retreat. Disregarding the thunderous sound of cannons, she rushed towards the artillery positions with Viscount Pine, tending to the injured struck by the short spears. It was hard to imagine that half a year ago, she would faint at the sight of blood. Throughout the entire battle, only 5 individuals were wounded, all from spear throwers, and miraculously, all 5 survived. Amidst cheers, many soldiers saluted her, watching her depart the battlefield. Levin's blazing anger gradually cooled, replaced by a growing sense of fear. His few remaining cavalrymen pursued Nightingale, and he ordered them to consume the pills and find her. Suddenly, two massive vines descended from above, ensnaring the two cavalrymen. At that moment, the sound of footsteps trampling through the undergrowth echoed behind him. Expressionless, a woman in white approached, standing atop a horse. A frigid weapon pressed against his forehead. From this angle, Levon caught a glimpse of the face hidden beneath the hood. A demon? No, was this the witch? She is remarkably beautiful. Before the gunshot rang out, this was his final thought. The sun had yet to set, but the war had already come to an end. In fact, this battle was much easier than dealing with the Duke's coalition. No, it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Considering the effects of the pills, Roland didn't immediately order the First Army to pursue the enemy. Instead, he dispatched Lightning and Macy to scout. Without the pills, the addicted militia members deteriorated rapidly, and they were quickly caught up by the pursuing forces. The pursuit units swiftly gathered them all and escorted them to the Changji stronghold. Based on the information obtained from interrogating surrendered knights, Nightingale effortlessly dismantled the remaining garrison at the stronghold. The captain was shot on the spot. It took 4 days to reach the Changgu stronghold. In the castle dungeon, Roland's subordinates found Petrov, who appeared somewhat weary. However, considering his Count Noble status, he hadn't suffered any inhumane treatment. After nearly 3 months, the prince met with this representative once again. To prevent a recurrence of the stronghold falling, Roland immediately devised new plans, forming an army, constructing roads, and promoting education. He detailed everything on paper and demanded that Petrov put them into action immediately. Petrov assured him that he wouldn't disappoint Roland again. Next, he asked about how to handle the prisoners. Roland pondered for a moment, sighed, and said to keep them alive. They wouldn't survive for much longer anyway. The church's secret pills, which was also Timothy's objective, could temporarily unleash extraordinary power in ordinary people. However, once the drug's effects wore off, the users would gradually weaken and die. Boarding the little township, the prince embarked on his journey back. He stood at the bow of the ship, appearing troubled. Nightingale materialized beside him and asked, "Is it because of those civilians?" Roland sighed, gripping the wooden railing tightly. He knew they were all forced by Timothy. If they hadn't taken the church's pills and been manipulated, they wouldn't have acted as pawns for the enemy, dying in this unfamiliar land. Nightingale reached out and held his arm, comforting him. She said, "It's not your fault." Roland didn't hesitate to respond, knowing that it wasn't his fault. If Roland hadn't stopped them, the small town would have become a sacrifice to Timothy's lust for power. Everyone would have been killed: soldiers, residents, witches. Of course, the church, the creator of the pills, was also one of the main culprits. Nightingale looked at Roland and said, "So, you will destroy the church, put an end to the conflict, and ensure that people no longer have to kill each other for senseless reasons. Under your rule, regardless of their identity or status, whether they are ordinary people or witches, they can all live happily. Is that correct?" Roland looked into her sparkling eyes and nodded gently, "Yes, I promise." The ocean was like a vast expanse of azure land, only smoother. If Maisie were here, she would have chattered away, reporting how far they were from the islands. But now, all she could hear were the rhythmic sounds of the waves lapping against the ship's hull. Although it grew tedious after a while, for the crew, it was a fortunate rhythm, signifying good weather for sailing. An elderly man with speckled white hair approached her. It was surprising that they had truly settled on Slumbering Isle. Despite its large land area, however, when the tide rose, most of the land would be submerged, making it unsuitable for habitation. He questioned why they didn't settle in Crescent Bay instead. It was the second largest island and still had plenty of uninhabited land. Ash chuckled. "Not everyone is willing to deal with witches." Jack One-Eye was the captain of this ship, just as his name suggested. His face was adorned with an eye patch, concealing his left eye completely. He was one of the few captains who were willing to transport supplies for the witches. Ash was well aware that Slumbering Isle would be engulfed by the sea. It was precisely because of this that it remained an uninhabited island. Witches, being adept at manipulating nature, had the power to transform the island into their own sanctuary. She looked up at the sky and remarked, without the suppression of the church, they could create a completely different world, a brand new world. Ash changed the subject and asked the captain how long it had been since he last visited Slumbering Isle. Jack replied, "It's been about a month." He scratched the back of his head, recalling the playful antics of the beautiful and young girls on his ship, which had left his crew dumbfounded. Just then, a sailor raised his binoculars and spotted an island ahead. He immediately reported to the captain. Jack, initially skeptical, ascended the crow's nest and raised his own binoculars. To his astonishment, it was indeed Slumbering Isle, but it had changed. The entire ship's crew could hardly believe their eyes. The towering island rose above the sea level like a small mountain, with sheer and steep cliffs that extended for several yards to the summit. The witches on the island were going about their daily lives when one of them, with green hair, seemed to sense something. The witch beside her asked what was wrong. She tucked her hair behind her ear and said, "She's back." A young girl stood at the edge of the dock, ready to greet Ash. She lowered her head and greeted Ash with a curtsy. Ash gently patted the girl's head and chuckled, "No need for such formality." Captain Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. He never expected that they could make an entire island rise. Captain Jack muttered, "No wonder those church folks treat witches like demons. This is almost godlike." Little Molly interjected, "It didn't rise. We built a wall around the island." Though Molly had a petite figure, she was the main force behind the logistics of the entire Slumbering Isle. She could summon a massive blue slime that could carry several tons of cargo at once. Captain Jack looked disdainfully at the crew behind him and told them that not a single one of them could match the abilities of a young girl. He walked towards the center of the island, where various houses had been constructed. These buildings were unlike the typical wooden or stone houses. They seemed to have emerged from the depths of the earth with their foundations seamlessly integrated into the ground. The island had two docks, one built at sea level and the other suspended in midair. During high tide, the aerial dock aligned perfectly with the sea surface, and during low tide, it returned to the surface. Molly pointed towards the northernmost house and informed Ash that it was Queen Tilly's palace. Ash nodded, bidding farewell to the two before walking briskly toward the north. The creator of this new home was Tilly Wimbledon, the Witch Queen. Unlike royal palaces, this spacious house had no guards or locked doors. Ash walked through the courtyard and entered the grand hall, only to see a familiar figure with brown hair standing before her. She silently approached from behind and covered the brown-haired woman's eyes with her hand. "I'm back, Tilly," she said softly. Tilly wore a brown silk glove with a sparkling ruby embedded on the back of the hand. She explained that the magical gemstone altered the way magic operated. Tilly removed the glove and handed it to Ash, instructing her to imagine magic as something tangible and then release it through the stone. Deep in thought, Ash pondered for a while but failed to produce even a spark of electricity. Tilly had previously tested many individuals and found that out of 100 people, only 2 or 3 could quickly comprehend and unleash lightning through the stone. This raised a question in Tilly's mind: what exactly was magic? The abilities of witches varied greatly, but if the same abilities could be replicated using these stones, she was uncertain whether magic was artificial or naturally occurring. It was said that these magic stones were discovered in ancient ruins. There was a ruin rumored to be located in the eastern forest near Sea Peak County. Tilly expressed her desire to visit it personally. However, Ash interrupted, saying that it is one of the most dangerous places in Grey Castle. She had heard that Garcia's black sail fleet had set sail with the purpose of reaching Sea Peak County, which happened to be Timothy's territory. Ash suspected that Garcia intended to use his fleet to initiate a large-scale war. Tilly's expression grew concerned. If the internal conflict continued, the church would take advantage of the situation and Grey Castle would suffer the same fate as the kingdom of Yeongdong, being swallowed by the church. This statement left Ash momentarily stunned, as if she saw the image of Roland.
Tilly quickly noticed her unusual reaction and asked what was wrong.
Ash rubbed her forehead and explained that Tilly's demeanor just now resembled that of Roland Wimbledon, as Roland had uttered the same words. Tilly became intrigued, surprised that Ash had encountered him. Tilly expressed her curiosity and wanted to know what Ash had gained from their encounter. Upon hearing Ash's account, Tilly pondered for a moment before speaking up. This person isn't Roland Wimbledon.
He has been replaced. Ash was taken aback by this revelation.
Tilly squinted her eyes, knowing that Roland had gathered a significant number of witches around him. She suspected that one of the witches had taken control of him and assumed his appearance. Having grown up alongside Roland, Tilly knew him better than anyone. Roland was a person who willingly embraced debauchery, lacked ambition, had a penchant for women, and was both sleazy and detestable. His lies were always full of loopholes. Ash raised an eyebrow at Tilly's response, surprised by her remark about how Roland was perceived in Tilly's mind. Tilly sighed and admitted that despite everything, she still needed to establish contact with the Witch Alliance in the border town. After all, Roland was her brother, and even though his character was flawed, he wasn't irredeemable at his core. Compared to the other princes and princesses, he was the least harmful. Ash couldn't help but think of Wendy and the witches in the border town. She believed that those witches wouldn't resort to such actions. Furthermore, she had left Maisie there, and by the end of the month, she would bring back more news from Bordertown for Slumbering Isle.
Tilly stood up and looked at Ash. Now that Ash had returned, it was time to move on to the next phase of their plan, the cleansing operation. Tilly issued the command, declaring that there should be no trace of the church remaining in the bay. Ultimately, all the islands in the bay would become a haven for the witches. After repelling Timothy's forces, the border town returned to tranquility.
Scroll held a mirror in her hands, and it was the first time she saw her own reflection so clearly. Every witch had tried the mercury-coated mirror, which Soroya had simulated from the laboratory. She applied a bright coating directly to the glass using her ability, mimicking the effect of a mercury mirror while eliminating the risk of mercury vapor poisoning. Soroya said it was Prince Roland's idea, as it would make it more convenient for the witches. Ever since he learned about Soroya's evolution, he had been planning to create a microscope that could observe cellular structures. If they could witness the marvelous microscopic world firsthand, it might trigger the evolution of new abilities in the witches or, at the very least, ignite their interest in learning. Taking advantage of the ample afternoon sunlight, Prince Roland gathered all the members of the Witch Alliance in the backyard of the castle, and the first lesson on natural biology officially began. Once all the witches were assembled, Prince Roland placed two dark gray metallic instruments on the table. The microscope he claimed could reveal the microscopic world. After placing a few drops under the microscope, Roland proceeded to teach the witches how to use it. Anna saw movement in the water, not just one but many tiny organisms resembling small insects. The witches exclaimed in surprise as they observed various organisms, each with its unique appearance. Lightning even found a seemingly transparent crab-like creature. "Your Highness, are these really all insects?" asked Scroll. Roland explained that what they were seeing were probably protists or single-celled algae, and it would be more appropriate to classify them as microorganisms rather than insects. Seeing Scroll's confusion, he continued his explanation, stating that these microorganisms were also independent life forms, although much smaller in size. In addition to the ones they were observing, there were even smaller bacteria and viruses that couldn't be observed with the current magnification of the microscope. These microorganisms were responsible for food spoilage and various diseases. Roland's enthusiasm grew as he continued his explanations. These tiny life forms were everywhere, in vast numbers. Fortunately, most of them were intolerant to high temperatures, which explained why water should be boiled before drinking, fish should be thoroughly cooked before consumption, and bathing water should not be reused. It was all due to these microorganisms' presence and the potential harm they could cause. Nightingale is drinking the water from the well, but the moment she heard there are small bugs in the water, she spat the water out. As the witches continued to discuss their individual discoveries, Lily approached the microscope, recalling Roland's words about these small organisms being the cause of food spoilage. She released her magic, enveloping the water droplet under the microscope. Unexpectedly, a remarkable transformation occurred. Some of the insects started to tremble and rapidly changed their appearance. Their previously transparent bodies became covered in purple armor, and they sprouted numerous tendrils. They began assimilating the unaffected organisms around them, but it wasn't mere consumption. Lily could see that they were assimilating at an astonishing speed, using their sharp tendrils as swords to pierce the other microorganisms and transform them into their own likeness. Nightingale suddenly felt a change in the magic behind her. She sensed a subtle vibration of magic. A swirling mass of purple mist started to form, drawing in the surrounding magic like a miniature storm. This disturbance was only visible to Nightingale, and she snapped out of her astonishment, widening her eyes and holding her breath, determined not to miss any details. Unlike Anna and Soroya, who were oblivious to the unfolding events, this was Nightingale's first-hand experience of magic condensing. The center of the storm was none other than Lily. Completely absorbed in the microscopic world beneath the microscope, Lily was completely unaware of the qualitative change in her magic within her body. Eventually, the magic gathered inward, gradually coming to a halt. It formed into a compact mass, about the size of a fist, with a round shape and 8 pairs of undulating tendrils, 4 facing downwards and 4 facing upwards. At first glance, it resembled an insect. Roland was taken by surprise when he witnessed the remarkable effects of the first natural biology class, with Lily being the third witch to undergo evolution. Seeing the microorganisms arranged so neatly under the microscope startled him. They exhibited astonishing coordination and uniformity as if they were saluting Lily. Lily became the third witch to experience an ability evolution. The next step was conducting specific experiments, including studying the effects, duration, and influence of God Punishment Stone on her ability. Perhaps Lily's ability would pave the way for medical advancements in Border Town. The testing lasted for 3 days. Despite her usual inclination to argue, Lily diligently followed Roland's instructions. Roland instructed Lily to separate the summoned purple insects into the parent organism and the replicated organisms. Whenever Lily released magic, the initial mutated microorganism would be the parent organism. As long as the mother organism had a supply of magic, it could continue to exist. However, it would self-disperse if the distance exceeded 5 meters. Moreover, it would instantly dissipate within the range of the God Punishment Stone. On the other hand, the replicated organisms were not restricted by the God Punishment Stone, appearing as a truly new form of life. They could not reproduce through division and would only live for 1 day, also being susceptible to high temperatures. Roland also mentioned that assimilating deadly bacteria and viruses could serve as a rapid anti-inflammatory and sterilization method. After coming out of the bath, Lily explained to Rem that it was possible to evolve new abilities without understanding the theory of tiny balls, cells, bacteria, and fungi. By deeply understanding one's own ability, magic could undergo a qualitative transformation. Lily yawned and confessed that she didn't understand the concepts of cells, bacteria, and fungi, but she suggested that Rem could ask Anna to teach her. However, with Anna being busy every day, Rem didn't know when to approach her. Lily jokingly proposed that Rem could ask Anna during their bath time together.